Have you ever wondered how much betrayal a heart can endure before it finally breaks? In today's gripping story, we follow Ethan, a man whose seemingly perfect life is shattered by a devastating discovery. His wife, Maggie, harbors a secret emotional affair with her manipulative coworker, Ryan, and what starts as subtle changes in her behavior quickly spirals into a storm of betrayal, confrontation, and heartbreak. But this isn't just a story about infidelity. It's about resilience, self-discovery, and the lengths we go to reclaim our lives. Buckle up, because this emotional roller coaster will leave you questioning trust, forgiveness, and second chances. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay tuned for more powerful stories like this. Let's dive in. It was the summer of 2017 in the charming suburbs of Willow Creek. Picture-perfect houses lined the streets, their neatly trimmed hedges and pristine mailboxes hiding the whispers of secrets and scandals that often swirled just below the surface. This was the kind of place where everyone waved hello, but no one truly knew what went on behind closed doors. It was here, amidst the sunlit cul-de-sacs and neighborhood block parties, that our story begins. Our protagonist, Ethan Walters, was your quintessential everyman. In his late 30s, Ethan was the kind of guy everyone liked. A high school teacher by day and an amateur woodworker by night, he had a way of making people feel at ease. His students adored him, his friends trusted him, and his neighbors often leaned over the fence to ask for his advice on everything from barbecue techniques to car troubles. Ethan lived a quiet, content life in a cozy two-bedroom house with his wife, Maggie. Maggie was the yin to Ethan's yang. While he was easygoing and steady, Maggie was ambitious and energetic, with a sharp wit and a contagious laugh that could light up a room. A successful marketing executive, she had a knack for turning every challenge into an opportunity. Together, they had built a life that seemed idyllic to the outside world, a marriage rooted in mutual respect, shared laughter, and an unspoken understanding that they were each other's safe haven. But even the sturdiest foundations can develop cracks. The first signs were subtle, the kind of things you might overlook if you weren't paying attention. It started with Maggie working late more often. Her once dedicated involvement in their Friday pizza and movie nights began to wane. At first, Ethan brushed it off. Maggie had always been passionate about her career, and he admired that about her. "You're going to burn out if you keep this up," Ethan teased one evening as Maggie hurriedly gathered her laptop and bag for yet another late night at the office. "I'll be fine," she replied, flashing him a quick smile. "This campaign is just a big deal for the company, that's all. Once it's over, things will settle down." Ethan nodded, though a faint worry flickered in the back of his mind. Still, he trusted her, and in a marriage like theirs, trust was the cornerstone. But as the weeks turned into months, Maggie's late nights became more frequent, and her explanations for them grew vaguer. "Client meetings," she'd say, or "just tying up some loose ends." Ethan noticed other changes too. Small but unmistakable Maggie, who had always been thoughtful with her words, now seemed distracted during their conversations. Her responses often curt or absent-minded. She began dressing differently for work, swapping her usual business casual attire for more tailored and polished outfits that made Ethan do a double-take. "Big meeting today?" he asked once, gesturing to her sleek black dress as she adjusted her necklace in the mirror. "Something like that," she replied, her tone breezy but her eyes avoiding his. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He chalked it up to stress at first. After all, Maggie's job was demanding, and it wasn't uncommon for her to go all in during major projects. Yet, as the distance between them grew, so did Ethan's unease. One night, after Maggie had fallen asleep, Ethan found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The faint glow of her phone, charging on the nightstand, caught his eye. He turned over, trying to dismiss the intrusive thought gnawing at him. "Don't go there, Ethan," he told himself. But doubt is a persistent companion, and that night it kept him company until dawn. The tipping point came during the annual Willow Creek Spring Gala, a fundraising event for the local community center Ethan and Maggie had always attended together, and it was one of the few occasions where they let their hair down and mingled with neighbors over wine and hors d'oeuvres. This year, however, Maggie insisted she couldn't make it. "I have a last-minute meeting," she said, her voice tinged with what Ethan thought might be guilt. "You should still go, though represent the Walters clan." Ethan didn't push her. He knew better than to argue when Maggie was set on something, but as he arrived at the gala, a feeling of loneliness washed over him. He plastered on a smile and made small talk with neighbors, though his mind wandered back to Maggie. Then came the moment that planted the first seed of real doubt. While chatting with Sarah, a neighbor who worked in the same building as Maggie, Ethan casually mentioned her late-night meetings. "Oh, that's strange," Sarah said, tilting her head. "I thought the marketing team wrapped up their big campaign last month. Maggie must have something else on her plate." Ethan froze for a split second but quickly recovered, brushing it off with a vague reply. Inside, though, his heart was pounding. That night, as he drove home, the weight of suspicion pressed down on him like never before. He hated the way it felt. The mistrust, the paranoia. It wasn't who he was, and it wasn't what their marriage was built on. But something inside him whispered that he needed to know the truth. Over the next few days, Ethan began to notice patterns. Maggie's late nights often coincided with her increasingly frequent text messages and brief, hushed phone calls that she dismissed as work stuff. He tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, but his gut told a different story. The breaking point came one Saturday morning. Ethan had planned a surprise breakfast for Maggie, a way to rekindle some of the warmth that had been slipping away. But when he walked into the kitchen, he found Maggie staring at her phone, her face illuminated by its glow. She looked startled when she saw him and quickly put the phone down, but not before Ethan caught a glimpse of the message on the screen. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing." Ethan's heart dropped. Maggie scrambled for an explanation, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. Ethan didn't say anything either, not then. He just walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there, her face pale and her hands trembling. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt like a stranger in his own home. As the days went by, Ethan's life began to unravel in slow motion. He couldn't shake the image of that message on Maggie's phone. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing." The words were etched into his mind like a cruel taunt, yet he couldn't bring himself to confront her directly. Not yet. Ethan wanted to believe there was some explanation, some way this wasn't what it seemed, but deep down, he knew the truth. Maggie, his Maggie, was slipping away. Instead of addressing the issue head-on, Ethan decided to gather his thoughts and observe. He paid closer attention to her behavior, noting how she always seemed guarded, her phone now perpetually glued to her side. She was a master at deflection, dodging questions with half-hearted smiles and vague excuses that only deepened the pit of doubt in Ethan's stomach. One evening, while Maggie was working late yet again, Ethan found himself alone at home, the house unusually quiet. His gaze wandered to the photo on their mantel, a picture of the two of them from their honeymoon in Santorini. They were beaming, the sparkling Aegean Sea behind them. That version of Maggie felt like a distant memory, a shadow of the woman who now came home only to sleep. Ethan picked up his phone and dialed his best friend. Tom had been a constant in Ethan's life since college, someone who always had his back, no matter what. When Ethan poured out his suspicions, Tom's response was a mix of concern and pragmatism. "Look, man," Tom said, his voice steady. You need to get to the bottom of this. Sitting around and stewing isn't going to do you any good. If you're sure something's going on, you have to find out." Tom's words echoed in Ethan's mind long after the call ended. He wasn't the kind of person to snoop, but the idea of being blindsided, of living in the dark, felt unbearable. The next day, Ethan made a decision. He called a private investigator. Enter Jessica Morgan, a no-nonsense PI with a reputation for discretion and results. When Ethan first sat across from her in her small, unassuming office, he felt a mix of shame and relief. He hated that it had come to this, but Jessica's calm professionalism put him at ease. "I know it's hard," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "but you deserve to know the truth. Whatever it is, we'll handle it together." Over the following week, Jessica began her investigation. Meanwhile, Ethan tried to keep up appearances at home. It was a strange dance, pretending everything was normal while knowing that the life he thought he had was unraveling in real time. Jessica's updates were sparse but informative. Maggie's work meetings were real enough, but there were gaps in her schedule that couldn't be explained away. Then came the bombshell, photos of Maggie with another man. They weren't incriminating at first, just two people sitting together at a cafe, their conversation animated. But as Jessica dug deeper, the pieces began to fall into place. The man's name was Ryan Blake, a consultant Maggie's firm had recently hired. At first glance, he seemed harmless, charming, successful, and with an easy smile that made him the center of attention wherever he went. But the more Jessica uncovered, the more Ethan's suspicions were confirmed. Maggie and Ryan's interactions weren't just professional, they were intimate, too intimate. The photos told a story Ethan didn't want to believe. Maggie leaning in, just a little too close, her laughter unguarded in a way Ethan hadn't seen in years. Then there were the messages Jessica managed to retrieve, cryptic but damning. Ryan's words dripped with affection, and Maggie's replies were hesitant at first, but grew increasingly bold. One message stood out: "I hate lying to Ethan, but I can't stay away from you." Ethan's heart sank when he read it. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was betrayal, plain and simple. Back at home, the tension was palpable. Ethan tried to act normal, but the weight of what he knew made every interaction with Maggie feel like walking on shards of glass. She, too, seemed on edge, her smiles never quite reaching her eyes. It all came to a head one Friday evening. Maggie had just returned from another work meeting, her hair slightly tousled and her lipstick faded. Ethan was waiting for her in the living room, the folder of evidence from Jessica sitting on the coffee table. Maggie froze when she saw it, her eyes darting between Ethan and the folder. "Sit down," Ethan said, his voice calm but unyielding. Maggie hesitated, then slowly lowered herself onto the couch. The silence between them was deafening. "I know," Ethan said simply, sliding the folder toward her. "I know everything." Maggie's face paled as she opened the folder, the photos and messages spilling out like Pandora's box. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the evidence, her breath hitching with each new piece of proof. I can explain," she stammered, tears pooling in her eyes. "Don't," Ethan said, cutting her off. "Don't insult me with excuses." The next hour was a whirlwind of emotion. Anger, heartbreak, desperation. Maggie admitted to the affair, her words tumbling out in a flood of guilt and regret. She swore it wasn't physical, that it was just emotional, but to Ethan, the distinction felt hollow. "You betrayed me," he said, his voice breaking. "You gave a piece of yourself to someone else. How am I supposed to come back from that?" Maggie had no answer. For the first time in their marriage, she was truly speechless. In the days that followed, the house was filled with a suffocating silence. Maggie tried to make amends, throwing herself into apologies and promises to change, but Ethan couldn't shake the images, the messages, the lies. The trust that had been the cornerstone of their relationship was gone, replaced by a chasm too wide to bridge. Ethan confided in Tom again, who urged him to take his time and think things through. But Ethan knew, deep down, that the damage was irreparable. This wasn't just a bump in the road, it was a dead end. One evening, as he sat alone in the kitchen, Ethan made up his mind he would move forward, but not with Maggie. He deserved better than a marriage built on broken trust. Before we go any further, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a situation where trust was shattered? How did you handle it? Share your story. I'd love to hear it. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into Ethan's journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to me, and it helps us bring you more stories like this one. The tension in Ethan and Maggie's household was now palpable, a thick cloud of unease that neither of them could escape. Ethan had made his decision to move on, but before he could finalize anything, there was one thing he needed: closure. As much as he wanted to leave the wreckage of their marriage behind, there was a part of him that still craved answers. Why had Maggie chosen to betray their life together? What was it that Ryan gave her that Ethan couldn't? One fateful evening, Ethan decided to confront her again, not with anger this time, but with calm determination. "Maggie," he said as they sat across from each other in the living room, the distance between them feeling insurmountable. "I need to know the truth, not the watered-down version, the real reason." Maggie hesitated, her eyes welling up with tears. "I don't even know where to start," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Try," Ethan urged. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "I guess I just felt invisible," she admitted. "At work, I'm this confident, capable person, and people notice me, but at home, I don't know. It felt like we were just going through the motions. I didn't mean for it to happen with Ryan, it just did." Ethan listened in silence, his emotions warring within him. He wanted to be angry, to lash out, but instead he felt an overwhelming sadness. Had their marriage really come to this? Two people so lost in their own worlds that they couldn't see each other anymore? Meanwhile, Jessica, the private investigator, delivered another bombshell. Ryan wasn't the charming, upstanding consultant he appeared to be. Jessica uncovered that he had a history of entanglements with married women, leaving a trail of broken relationships and shattered trust in his wake. For Ryan, it wasn't about love or connection. It was about control, about feeding his own ego. When Ethan confronted Maggie with this new information, her face fell. "I didn't know," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought he cared about me." "Did you care about me?" Ethan countered, his tone sharper than he intended. Her silence was deafening. As the days turned into weeks, the tension reached a boiling point. One evening, Ethan found himself alone in the kitchen, staring at the divorce papers he had finally decided to draft. The reality of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. This was it, the end of the life he had built with Maggie. The memories, the laughter, the dreams, they were all slipping away, one painful moment at a time. But Maggie wasn't ready to give up without a fight. One night she came home and found Ethan packing up some of his things. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice panicked. "I'm leaving," Ethan replied, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "No," Maggie said, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Ethan, don't do this. I can't lose you." Ethan turned to face her, his own eyes brimming with unshed tears. "You already lost me, Maggie. The moment you chose him, you lost me." Maggie collapsed onto the couch, her sobs echoing through the empty house. It was the sound of a woman who had finally realized the magnitude of what she had done. The story took another dramatic turn when Ethan received a call from Jessica. "I thought you'd want to know," Jessica said. "Ryan's wife found out about the affair she's filing for divorce." Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions: vindication, sadness, and even a twinge of pity for Maggie. Her world was crumbling around her, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Not that he wanted to. In the days that followed, the news spread through the small community of Willow Creek like wildfire. Ryan, once the charming consultant everyone admired, was now the subject of scandal and gossip. Maggie, too, found herself under scrutiny. Friends who once welcomed her with open arms now kept their distance, their judgment palpable. For Ethan, it was a bittersweet moment. He had the closure he sought, but it came at a cost. The life he had built with Maggie was gone, and all that remained were the broken pieces. As Ethan began to move forward with his life, he found solace in the things that once brought him joy. He returned to his woodworking, pouring his emotions into each carefully crafted piece. He reconnected with old friends, finding comfort in their support and understanding. Maggie, on the other hand, struggled to pick up the pieces. Ryan, predictably, abandoned her as soon as his marriage was over. She was left to face the consequences of her choices alone, her once bright future now overshadowed by regret. But even in the darkest moments, there was a glimmer of hope. Ethan began to see that life after betrayal wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving. Slowly but surely, he started to rebuild, piece by piece, step by step. Before we dive into the final stretch of this story, take a moment to let me know what you think in the comments below. How would you handle a situation like Ethan's? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this journey. As the days passed, the cracks in Maggie's world deepened, and Ethan found himself standing at the edge of the storm's climax. The divorce papers sat on the counter like a silent declaration of the end. Ethan knew this wasn't just about walking away from a marriage. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his peace, and the version of himself he had almost lost. Yet, as resolute as he was, the finality of it all hung heavy in the air. Maggie, on the other hand, was grasping at straws. Every attempt to apologize, to explain, or to convince Ethan that they could fix what was broken felt like trying to hold water in her hands. She had lost Ryan, the man she thought had given her what Ethan couldn't, and now, the one constant in her life, Ethan, was slipping through her fingers too. It was a cold Wednesday evening when the turning point came. Ethan had spent the day at Tom's house, discussing his next steps. As he drove home, his thoughts were a jumble of emotions: anger, sadness, and, surprisingly, a glimmer of hope for the future. He knew he was making the right decision, but that didn't make it any easier. When he walked into the house, the first thing he noticed was the silence. No television hum, no faint sound of Maggie working upstairs. Just silence. His stomach churned as he called out her name, but there was no response. Then he saw it, a note on the kitchen table, written in Maggie's familiar handwriting. The note was short but heartfelt. "Ethan, I know I've destroyed us, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to tell you, one last time, that I'm sorry for everything." Maggie panic set in as Ethan realized her car wasn't in the driveway. He picked up his phone and tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. 1,000 worst-case scenarios ran through his mind. Had she left town? Had she done something drastic? Despite everything, Ethan couldn't bear the thought of losing her completely. Ethan called Tom, who immediately came over to help. Together, they began retracing Maggie's steps, starting with her usual haunts: the office, her favorite cafe, even the local park where she often went to clear her head, but she was nowhere to be found. Just as the night stretched into the early hours of the morning, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was Jessica, the private investigator. She had heard about Maggie's disappearance through a mutual acquaintance and offered her help. "Let's think logically," Jessica said. "Has she mentioned any place that holds special meaning to her? Somewhere she might go when she's feeling overwhelmed?" Ethan paused, his mind racing. Then it hit him. Their old cabin by the lake, the one they used to escape to during the early years of their marriage. It had been years since they'd visited, but it was the one place that held memories of their happier times. Ethan and Tom drove through the winding roads to the lake, the air thick with tension. When they arrived, the cabin was dark, but Maggie's car was parked outside. Ethan's heart pounded as he approached the door and knocked. "Maggie?" he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. A moment later, the door creaked open, and there she was, disheveled, tear-streaked, and looking more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. "I didn't think you'd come," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't have a choice," Ethan replied. "What are you doing here?" Maggie gestured for him to come inside. The cabin was cold, the fireplace unlit, and the room filled with an eerie stillness. She sank into the old armchair by the window, hugging a blanket around her shoulders. I needed to get away," she said. "From the house, from the whispers, from everything I've ruined so much. Ethan and I didn't know how to face it." Ethan sat across from her, his emotions a mix of anger and empathy. "Running away doesn't fix anything," he said. "You need to face what you've done, own it." "I know," Maggie whispered, "but it's not just about what I've done to you, it's what I've done to myself. I let my insecurities, my doubts, consume me, and in trying to fill some void, I destroyed the one thing that mattered most." Her words were raw, cutting through the tension like a blade. For a moment, Ethan saw the woman he had fallen in love with, the one who wore her heart on her sleeve, who fought fiercely for what she believed in. But that woman was buried beneath layers of regret and betrayal. As they talked, the conversation grew more heated. Maggie begged for another chance, her tears flowing freely. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said. "Therapy, counseling, anything. I just can't lose you, Ethan." Ethan's response was measured but firm. "Maggie, this isn't just about what you want. This is about trust, and you shattered that. I can't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering if it'll happen again." Maggie sobbed, but Ethan held his ground. "I don't hate you," he said, his voice softening. "I could never hate you, but I can't live like this. We both deserve better." In that moment, Maggie seemed to finally accept the reality of their situation. Her shoulders slumped, and she nodded slowly. "You're right," she said. "We do." The drive home was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Maggie agreed to sign the divorce papers, and Ethan promised to give her the space she needed to rebuild her life. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was an ending nonetheless. Over the next few weeks, Ethan began to feel a sense of closure. He threw himself into his woodworking, creating pieces that reflected his journey. A coffee table etched with waves to symbolize his resilience. A chair carved with intricate patterns to represent growth. Maggie, meanwhile, started therapy. She knew she had a long road ahead, but for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope, not for their marriage, but for herself. Before we continue to the conclusion of this story, let me know what you think in the comments. Have you ever faced a situation where letting go was the only way forward? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. The storm reached its peak on what should have been an ordinary Thursday. Ethan had started to settle into his new routine, a life that didn't revolve around Maggie's excuses or late-night meetings. His days were filled with work, evenings spent sanding down planks of wood in his garage, and quiet nights where he could finally think without the noise of suspicion in his head. But just as the waters seemed to calm, a new wave crashed into his life. It came late in the afternoon. Ethan was in his garage, meticulously carving the intricate details of a new project, when his phone buzzed on the workbench. He wiped his hands on a rag and glanced at the screen. Jessica Morgan. "Jessica," he answered, a slight apprehension in his voice. "What's going on?" Her tone was urgent. "Ethan, I don't want to alarm you, but you need to hear this. I've been keeping tabs on Ryan Blake, just as a precaution. It turns out he's not taking the fallout from his marriage well. He's been asking questions about Maggie, about you. I think he's trying to involve himself again." Ethan's heart sank. Ryan had already wreaked enough havoc in his life. The idea of him coming back around, stirring the pot when things were finally settling, ignited a deep frustration within him. "Thanks for letting me know," Ethan said. "I'll handle it." But what did handle it even mean? Ethan wasn't a confrontational person by nature, but this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting what little peace he'd managed to reclaim. The next day, Ethan's fears became reality. As he was leaving work, he spotted a sleek black car idling at the curb. At first, he didn't think much of it, until the driver's window rolled down, revealing Ryan's smug face. "Ethan," Ryan called out, his tone laced with faux friendliness. "Got a minute?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he approached cautiously. "What do you want?" Ryan leaned against the car door, his expression infuriatingly casual. "Just thought we should talk man to man." "There's nothing to talk about," Ethan shot back. "Whatever you had with Maggie is over. She's trying to move on, so am I." Ryan smirked. "Oh, I'm sure that's what she told you, but people like Maggie don't just walk away. She's not built for being alone." The insinuation hit Ethan like a punch to the gut, but he didn't let it show. "Stay away from us," he said, his voice firm. "You've done enough damage." Ryan's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "We'll see," he said cryptically before driving off, leaving Ethan standing on the sidewalk, his fists clenched. Later that evening, Ethan decided to tell Maggie about the encounter. As much as he didn't want to see her, he knew she deserved to be warned. When he arrived at the house, Maggie looked surprised to see him, but her expression quickly shifted to concern when he told her what had happened. "Ryan came to see you?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. "What did he say?" Ethan recounted the conversation, watching as Maggie's face grew pale. "I thought I was done with him," she whispered, more to herself than to Ethan. "I haven't spoken to him since everything." "Well, he's not done with you," Ethan said bluntly. "You need to be careful. Maggie people like Ryan don't just go quietly." Maggie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Ethan, for everything. If I had known what kind of person he was—" "It's too late for that," Ethan interrupted. "You made your choices, Maggie. Now we have to deal with the consequences." For the first time in weeks, Maggie seemed genuinely remorseful, not just for what she had done to Ethan, but for the mess she had brought into both of their lives. She promised to take precautions, but Ethan could tell she was shaken. The tension came to a head 2 days later. Ethan was at home when his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Tom. "Ethan, you need to get down to the cafe on Main Street," Tom said, his voice urgent. "Maggie's here, and so is Ryan. Things are getting heated." Ethan's heart raced as he grabbed his keys and headed out the door. When he arrived, the scene inside the cafe was chaotic. Maggie was standing near the counter, her face flushed with anger, while Ryan loomed over her, his tone condescending and aggressive. "Ryan, stop!" Maggie said, her voice trembling. "This isn't the time or place." Ethan didn't hesitate. He pushed through the crowd, stepping between them. "Back off," he said, his voice low and commanding. Ryan turned to face him, his expression smug. "Ethan, nice of you to join us." "I said, back off," Ethan repeated. Ryan scoffed, but took a step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, I was just having a conversation with Maggie." "This isn't a conversation," Ethan said. "It's harassment. Leave her alone." For a moment, it seemed like Ryan might push back, but something in Ethan's tone made him think twice. He muttered something under his breath before turning and walking out of the cafe. The crowd slowly dispersed, and Maggie sank into a chair, visibly shaken. Ethan sat across from her, his adrenaline still pumping. "Are you okay?" he asked. Maggie nodded, though her hands trembled. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice breaking. "For everything, you shouldn't have to deal with this because of me." Ethan sighed, the weight of the situation settling over him. "We both made mistakes, Maggie, but this ends now. No more Ryan, no more excuses, just move on for both our sakes." Maggie looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and regret. "I'll try," she said softly. "Thank you, Ethan." In the days that followed, Ethan took steps to ensure that Ryan was out of their lives for good. With Jessica's help, they filed a restraining order against him, cutting off any remaining ties. Maggie, for her part, followed through on her promise to seek therapy and work on herself. For Ethan, the final confrontation marked the end of a chapter. It wasn't the clean, happy resolution he had once hoped for, but it was enough he could finally see a path forward, a life where he wasn't defined by betrayal or pain. Before we wrap up this chapter of Ethan's journey, let me know what you think in the comments below. What would you have done in Ethan's shoes? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories like this. As the fallout from Ryan's interference settled, Ethan began to feel a strange mix of relief and lingering tension. While the restraining order against Ryan gave him and Maggie a measure of protection, it was clear that the storm wasn't completely over. The emotional scars were still fresh, and both of them were navigating the aftermath of their choices. For Ethan, it wasn't just about protecting Maggie anymore. It was about finding closure and finally reclaiming control over his life. A week after the cafe confrontation, Ethan received an unexpected call from Jessica. Her tone was measured but hinted at something significant. "Ethan," she began, "I wasn't planning to dig further into Ryan's background, but something didn't sit right with me. There's more to this story than we thought." Ethan's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "I found out that Ryan has a history of not just manipulating women but actively sabotaging their lives when things don't go his way," Jessica explained. "He's been involved in multiple lawsuits for workplace harassment, and there's evidence that he's blackmailed others in the past." Ethan sat back in his chair, processing this new information. "Why didn't this come up sooner?" "Because Ryan's good at covering his tracks," Jessica replied. "But here's the thing. One of his former colleagues reached out to me. She claims Ryan has been spreading rumors about you and Maggie at your workplace." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had worked hard to maintain his professionalism despite the chaos in his personal life, and the idea of Ryan tarnishing his reputation made his blood boil. "What's the next step?" Ethan asked. Jessica's answer was simple. Confront him, but this time, do it legally. Armed with the evidence Jessica had gathered, Ethan and Maggie met with a lawyer to discuss their options. The lawyer, a sharp and confident woman named Claire Stanton, outlined a plan to hold Ryan accountable. "We can file a defamation suit," Claire explained. "Given his history and the restraining order, we have a strong case, but we'll need to gather more testimony from those he's harmed in the past." Maggie, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. "I'll help," she said firmly. "If there's anything I can do to stop him from doing this to someone else, I'll do it." Ethan glanced at her, surprised by her resolve. Despite everything that had happened between them, he couldn't deny that Maggie was taking responsibility for her part in the mess. The legal proceedings took weeks to organize, but when the day finally came, it felt like a culmination of all the tension that had been building. Ethan and Maggie arrived at the courthouse together. their shared determination outweighing the awkwardness of their fractured relationship. Ryan, as expected, denied everything. He sauntered into the courtroom with the same smug confidence that had infuriated Ethan from the start. But as the testimonies piled up and the evidence was presented, that confidence began to crack. Jessica's investigation had uncovered more than enough to paint a damning picture of Ryan's behavior. Witness after witness testified to his manipulation and deceit, their stories eerily similar to Maggie's experience. The turning point came when Maggie took the stand. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke about how Ryan had exploited her vulnerabilities and jeopardized her marriage, her confidence grew. "I made mistakes," she admitted, her voice steady. "But Ryan knew exactly what he was doing. He preyed on my insecurities and convinced me to betray the person I cared about most. And when I tried to end things, he refused to let go." Her testimony was a powerful moment, one that left the courtroom silent. Ethan felt a surge of conflicting emotions, pride in Maggie for standing up for herself, and a lingering sadness for everything they had lost. In the end, the court ruled in Ethan and Maggie's favor. Ryan was ordered to pay damages for defamation and was issued a permanent restraining order. The victory was bittersweet. It couldn't undo the damage, but it marked the end of Ryan's hold over their lives. As they left the courthouse, Maggie turned to Ethan. "Thank you," she said, "for standing by me through this, even when I didn't deserve it." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "We both needed this closure." With the legal battle behind them, Ethan and Maggie finally began to move forward. But on separate paths, Ethan finalized the divorce, and while the process was painful, it also felt liberating. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe again. Maggie, too, began to rebuild her life. Therapy became a cornerstone of her recovery, helping her confront the choices that had led to her downfall. She reached out to old friends, mended relationships where she could, and focused on rediscovering who she was outside of her mistakes. For Ethan, the future looked brighter with each passing day. He poured himself into his woodworking, turning his garage into a full-fledged studio. The projects he created weren't just art, they were a reflection of his resilience, his growth, and his ability to start anew. Before we dive into the final resolution of Ethan's journey, let me know what you think in the comments below. Would you have taken the same steps he did? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you can join me for more stories like this. The days following the court ruling felt like the calm after a thunderstorm, quiet, but with lingering tension in the air. For Ethan, there was no sudden wave of relief, no immediate sense of triumph. The damage Ryan had inflicted, and the choices Maggie had made, were wounds that would take time to heal. But there was something comforting in knowing that the fight was over. The storm had passed, and now it was time to rebuild. Maggie, too, was grappling with the fallout. The courtroom victory, while a relief, didn't erase the mistakes she had made or the life she had shattered. Her once busy social calendar was now empty, replaced with long introspective evenings spent poring over self-help books and reflecting on where it all went wrong. One afternoon, she decided to visit her therapist, Dr. Karen Nolan. For an impromptu session, Maggie sat in the familiar, cozy office, her hands gripping a mug of chamomile tea as Dr. Nolan studied her carefully. "I feel stuck," Maggie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like I can see the pieces of my life, but I don't know how to put them back together." Dr. Nolan nodded. "That's a normal feeling after a major upheaval, but the first step isn't putting the pieces back, it's deciding which ones are worth keeping." Maggie's eyes welled with tears. "How do I figure that out?" "You start by being honest with yourself," Dr. Nolan said gently. "What do you truly want, not for anyone else, but for yourself?" It was a question Maggie had avoided for months, but now she knew it was time to confront it. Meanwhile, Ethan's journey of self-discovery was taking a more tangible form. His woodworking studio, once a quiet escape, had become a symbol of his resilience. Orders for custom pieces started rolling in, and Ethan found himself pouring his emotions into every creation. One day, as he worked on a new commission, a dining table etched with intricate patterns of leaves and vines, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about the craft, it was about creating something enduring, something beautiful, from raw, broken materials. It mirrored his own life in a way that felt poetic. But Ethan's transformation wasn't just professional. His personal life was beginning to bloom in unexpected ways. At a local art market, where he had set up a booth to display his work, he met Lila, a photographer with an eye for capturing life's quiet, unguarded moments. Lila was warm and grounded, with a laugh that made Ethan feel at ease in a way he hadn't felt in years. Their conversation started out casually, discussing their creative processes and sharing stories about their respective crafts. But over time, those conversations grew deeper. They talked about their pasts, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. Ethan found himself looking forward to their chats, feeling a glimmer of something he hadn't dared to hope for: connection. Just as Ethan was beginning to embrace this new chapter, Maggie reached out to him. It was a cold evening, and Ethan was at home when his phone buzzed with a text from her. "Can we talk? Just once more?" Ethan stared at the message, conflicted. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to leave the past in the past, but another part of him, perhaps the part that still carried a shred of love for the woman he had shared a decade of his life with, felt compelled to respond. "Okay," he typed back, "tomorrow at the park." The next day, Ethan arrived at the park, the crisp winter air biting at his cheeks. Maggie was already there, sitting on a bench by the pond. She looked different, tired, but also lighter, as if the weight of her guilt had begun to lift. "Thanks for coming," she said as Ethan approached. He nodded, sitting beside her but keeping a careful distance. "What's on your mind?" Maggie hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I wanted to apologize, not just for what I did, but for how I handled everything afterward. I was selfish. Ethan, I let my insecurities dictate my actions, and I hurt you in ways I can't ever take back." Ethan listened silently, his expression unreadable. "I know I can't fix what I broke," Maggie continued, "but I needed to tell you that I'm trying to be better for myself, and I hope, someday, you can forgive me." Ethan let her words settle in the air for a moment before he responded. "I appreciate that," he said, "and I do forgive you, but forgiving you doesn't mean we can go back to what we had. That's gone." Maggie nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I know, I needed you to hear it." They sat in silence for a while, watching the ducks glide across the pond. There was a sadness between them, but also a sense of closure, a mutual understanding that their story, while painful, had reached its final chapter. As Maggie walked away, Ethan felt a strange sense of peace. He had been carrying the weight of their broken marriage for so long, but now it felt like he could finally let it go. He returned to his studio that evening, the scent of freshly sanded wood filling the air. As he worked on his latest piece, his thoughts drifted to Lila and the possibility of what could be. It was a cautious hope, but hope nonetheless. Ethan knew that life wouldn't magically fall into place overnight. There would still be challenges, moments of doubt, and the occasional pang of regret. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next, with an open heart and the knowledge that he had the strength to rebuild. As we near the conclusion of Ethan's story, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to let go of something you once thought was unshakable? Share your story below, And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more compelling recaps like this one. As Ethan moved forward with his life, the tension that had once defined his every waking moment began to ebb. Yet, just as he started to feel a sense of normalcy, the story reached its most critical turning point. It began with an unexpected call from Maggie late one evening. Ethan was in his studio, working on a set of handcrafted shelves, when his phone buzzed. Seeing Maggie's name on the screen, he hesitated before answering. "Maggie?" he said cautiously. Her voice was shaky, bordering on frantic. "Ethan, I didn't know who else to call. It's Ryan. He showed up at my apartment." Ethan's heart sank. "What do you mean? Did he do something?" "No," she said quickly. "He was just there. He wouldn't leave, kept talking about how I owed him another chance, how he wasn't going to let me walk away. I managed to get him to leave, but it scared me." Ethan clenched his jaw, his mind racing. Ryan had crossed so many lines already, and now he was escalating. "Did you call the police?" he asked. "I didn't know if I should," Maggie admitted. "He didn't actually do anything, and I didn't want to make things worse." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to keep his frustration in check. "Maggie, you can't handle this alone. I'll come over." When Ethan arrived at Maggie's apartment, the tension in the air was palpable. She looked visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she opened the door. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "Of course," Ethan replied. "But Maggie, you need to report this. He can't keep getting away with this behavior." Before Maggie could respond, there was a loud knock at the door. Both of them froze. Maggie's eyes widened in fear as Ethan stepped in front of her protectively. The knock came again, harder this time. "Maggie, I know you're in there." Ryan's voice was muffled but unmistakable. Ethan opened the door just enough to step outside. Closing it behind him, Ryan stood on the other side, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. "Ryan," Ethan said coldly, "you need to leave now." Ryan sneered. "What are you, her bodyguard now? This doesn't concern you." "It does when you show up uninvited and scare her," Ethan shot back. "She's made it clear she doesn't want anything to do with you. Leave her alone." Ryan took a step closer, his posture aggressive. "You think you can just step in and play the hero? You have no idea what's really going on." Ethan held his ground, his voice firm. "I know enough to see exactly who you are, and I'm done letting you manipulate and intimidate people. This ends tonight." Ryan opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of a siren in the distance made him pause. Maggie had called the police while Ethan was outside. Ryan's eyes darted toward the street, and without another word, he turned and walked away. When the police arrived, Ethan and Maggie gave their statements, ensuring there was a record of the incident. The officers assured Maggie that they would follow up and advised her to take extra precautions in the meantime. Back inside, Maggie sank onto the couch, her composure finally breaking. "I hate that I let it get this far," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I should have listened to you, Ethan. I should have done something sooner." Ethan sat beside her, his tone gentle but firm. "What matters is that you're doing something now. Ryan won't stop unless someone holds him accountable." Maggie nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'll file another restraining order first thing in the morning." For the first time in a long time, Ethan saw a glimmer of strength in Maggie's eyes. She wasn't the same woman who had let Ryan manipulate her. She was fighting back. The confrontation with Ryan was a stark reminder of how far Ethan had come and how much further he had to go. For months, he had been defined by the betrayal and chaos Maggie's choices had brought into his life. But now, standing up to Ryan, he realized something important. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was taking control. Later that night, back in his studio, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The anger, the heartbreak, the uncertainty. It had all been part of a process a path that was slowly leading him toward something stronger. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Lila's name. Hesitating for only a moment, he typed a message. "Hey, I was wondering if you'd like to grab coffee sometime. No pressure, just thought I'd ask." Within minutes, her reply came, "I'd love to. Let me know when." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, he allowed himself to hope, not just for a new relationship, but for a future where he wasn't defined by his past. True to her word, Maggie filed another restraining order against Ryan and began taking steps to rebuild her sense of security. She installed new locks, joined a self-defense class, and leaned heavily on her therapist for support. More importantly, Maggie started focusing on her own growth. She volunteered at a local community center, helping other women who had faced similar challenges. It was her way of making amends, not just to Ethan, but to herself. One evening, she wrote Ethan a letter. It wasn't an apology. She had already given him plenty of those, but a thank you. She thanked him for his strength, for standing by her even when he had every reason not to, and for showing her that it was never too late to change. Ethan read the letter late at night, sitting at his workbench. It was bittersweet, but it gave him a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. Before we move to the final chapter of Ethan's story, let me know what you think in the comments. How would you handle a situation like this? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more compelling stories like this one. The morning light streamed through the windows of Ethan's studio, casting warm, golden hues over the half-finished pieces scattered throughout the space. It had been weeks since the incident with Ryan, and for the first time in months, Ethan felt at peace. The confrontation had been a catalyst, not just for Maggie, but for him. It forced him to look at his life and ask himself what he truly wanted. Ethan had spent so long holding on to the pain of what had happened that he hadn't realized how much space it was taking up. But now, as he sanded down the edges of a new coffee table, he realized he was ready to let it go. His future was no longer tethered to the past, and he was eager to see where it might take him. Maggie, too, had come a long way. The Maggie who once allowed her insecurities to control her decisions was gone, replaced by someone who had fought to reclaim her sense of self-worth. She continued volunteering at the community center, mentoring women who were rebuilding their lives just as she was. Through her work, Maggie discovered a passion for advocacy, helping others find their voices and stand up for themselves. It wasn't an easy path. She had her moments of doubt and guilt, but each step forward felt like a victory. Maggie and Ethan stayed in touch sporadically. Their conversations were brief but meaningful, a testament to the respect that had grown between them despite everything. They weren't friends, not in the traditional sense, but there was a quiet understanding that they had both come out stronger. Ethan's relationship with Lila blossomed slowly, like a plant growing toward the sun. Their first coffee date turned into a series of casual outings, gallery visits, hikes, and long conversations over late-night cups of tea. Lila's warmth and openness were a stark contrast to the guarded, tense dynamic Ethan had grown accustomed to in his marriage. One evening, as they sat by the river watching the sunset, Lila turned to Ethan and asked, "Do you ever think about the future? What you want it to look like?" Ethan smiled, gazing at the horizon. "I used to think I had it all figured out, but now I think I just want to keep building. My work, my life, my relationships. I'm learning that it's okay to take it one day at a time." Lila reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. "Sounds like a pretty good plan to me." In that moment, Ethan realized something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, not the cautious, fragile hope he'd clung to during his darkest days, but a genuine belief that good things were still ahead. As for Ryan, his actions finally caught up with him. The restraining order, combined with the legal battles he faced from other women he had manipulated, left him with few allies and even fewer opportunities. His professional reputation was in shambles, and he quickly faded into the background, a footnote in Ethan and Maggie's lives. Ethan didn't dwell on Ryan. To him, Ryan represented a chapter that was firmly closed. What mattered now was moving forward, free from the shadows of the past. Months later, Ethan stood in his studio, putting the finishing touches on a custom bookshelf he had been working on for weeks. The piece was intricate, with delicate carvings of tree branches and leaves that seemed to grow organically from the wood. It was one of his finest works yet, a testament to how far he had come, not just as a craftsman, but as a person. As he stepped back to admire his work, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Lila. "Finished my shoot early. Want to grab dinner?" Ethan smiled and replied, "Absolutely, be there in an hour." Before leaving, he took a moment to reflect. The journey he had been on, the heartbreak, the betrayal, the healing, had shaped him in ways he never could have anticipated. He had faced his pain head-on, learned to let go, and rediscovered the things that truly mattered. And while life would never be perfect, it didn't need to be. It was enough to know that he had the strength to weather any storm and the courage to keep moving forward. Meanwhile, Maggie stood in the community center, leading a workshop on self-empowerment. She glanced at the women in the room, each of them at a different stage of their own journeys, and felt a sense of pride. She might never fully escape the consequences of her actions, but she had found a way to turn her mistakes into something meaningful. As the session ended, one of the women approached her. "Thank you," she said. "Hearing your story made me realize I'm not alone." Maggie smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You're not," she replied, "and you never will be." For Maggie, redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, growing from it, and using it to build a better future. The story ends with Ethan and Lila walking along the same riverbank where they had shared so many conversations. The sun was setting, casting the world in hues of gold and orange. Lila leaned into Ethan, and for the first time in a long time, he felt completely at peace. "This feels right," Ethan said softly. Lila smiled, her eyes full of warmth. "It does." As they continued down the path, the camera pans out, capturing the serene beauty of the moment. The image fades, leaving viewers with a sense of closure, hope, and the reminder that even in the face of heartbreak, there is always the possibility of a new beginning. And that's it for Ethan's story. Let me know in the comments what you thought about his journey and the choices he made. Have you ever had to start over after a major life change? Share your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.